This content should not be construed as financial or investment advice. I am simply sharing my personal views and perspectives, which I hope will educate and inform and help give you the confidence to make your own financial decisions. If you need financial investment advice, please seek in-person advice from a qualified, experienced, and regulated finance professional. YouTube will not save you.
Hello, I'm the fourth accountant, and today we're going to be talking about Andy Burnham, the Prime Minister in waiting, it seems. So at the time of recording, there is essentially a Labour leadership contest happening. However, there's only been one nomination so far, which is Andy Burnham, and a number of other high-profile candidates such as Wes Streeting have actually ruled themselves out. So the wide expectation is that Andy Burnham will become Labour leader, and then he will be sworn in as Prime Minister sometime around late July, essentially. I believe it might be around the 20th of July at the time of recording. So the ongoing question will be, amongst many things, is what difference we may see in terms of the direction of Labour and their manifesto, and more particularly from my own perspective, what they're going to be doing in terms of wealth taxes, if anything at all. Now, the impression we've been getting is that Andy Burnham will basically be sticking to much of Labour's existing manifesto. So again, I don't expect any particular major or seismic shocks in terms of the direction he wishes to take Labour. And that's pretty much how I've always felt about Andy Burnham and any of the candidates that would have been or would have become the Labour leader. So again, as I've said many times in many of my videos previously, Labour are a very central, or position themselves as a centrist party, and they would consider themselves, I would say, leftist, although many would argue they're actually right, but relative to the Conservatives and certainly Reform, they are the left of politics in terms of the mainstream, and therefore they're not likely to consider any policies that are considered to be radical. And I think wealth taxes at the moment, they're still going through this debate as to whether or not we would consider them fair. And there's still challenges around that, which we'll discuss a bit later on in this video. So although he does represent an opportunity as far as someone like Gary Stevenson is concerned, with respect to introducing a wealth tax, the reality is, and my own expectation, is that he will not consider this unless he is forced to do so. So as I say, unless there's more traction from other parties, say the left, the Green Party, for example, or the Liberal Democrats, and they start picking up votes and start stealing votes, let's say, from Labour, then I don't, on the basis that they're willing to introduce a wealth tax, and there's a perception that is the reason why they are attracting votes, then I don't think Labour will address that. And I think that is largely why we've seen historically Labour move more to the right, because when more right-leaning policies start gaining traction, such as border controls, such as Brexit, for example, such as increasing the length of stay that individuals need to, or immigrants need to work before they have indefinite leave of stay. These are many things that have been borrowed from the right of politics, such as Reform and such as the Conservatives. So as I say, my own feeling around Labour, and it's just my own personal view, is that they tend to follow many of the other parties. And the main things that they may lead on is things like investment and the welfare state. So that tends to be their bread and butter, and they tend to lead in that area. Then all of these other areas I've described, they tend to, in my view, follow other parties. So I don't have a lot of hope regarding an introduction of a meaningful wealth tax in the mold that, say, someone like Gary Stevenson would like, coming from someone like Andy Burnham. And I believe anecdotally that he is not considering it a priority, which is basically my own expectation, essentially, with respect to what Andy Burnham will do. However, he has actually signalled to a number of potential tax reforms, which he would probably argue is leaning more towards a wealth tax, because it is understood, for example, that he believes workers are taxed too much. And he does apparently, and this is just something I'm hearing on the grapevine, want to address that. So we'll talk through the potential options I believe he is looking at, and then we will then revisit the idea of a wealth tax, why potentially he does not consider it a viable option, but why I would argue it is something that is still potentially necessary. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, and it's something that Wes Streeting mentioned actually, is alignment of the CGT, so this is capital gains tax bandings, with that of income tax. So with income tax, there's a number of different bandings. So I believe you have a 20% rate, a 40% rate, and a 45% rate. Whilst with CGT, for example, you have around, I think, a 22% rate, which can be applied. Now, what is being proposed and was initially being proposed by Wes Streeting, but there is a view that Andy Burnham may also adopt this position, is that whatever the income bandings are, there will be exactly the same bandings for capital gains tax as well. So therefore, there'll be no difference in the tax you pay, whether you're selling an asset or whether you're earning an income through salaried work. And the idea here is that basically the very wealthy are selling assets, and when they sell those assets, they are therefore going to pay more tax on those assets. And again, I think it's an interesting idea, but in my own view, and it's something again I have talked about in at least one previous video, is that I do not consider this an actual wealth tax. I consider it a transactional tax in the same way. If you sell a second home, for example, you are basically then paying a transaction tax. And if you buy anything as a consumer, then again, you are subject to VAT, which is a transaction tax. And even when you buy a home, and this will be your primary residence, you are subject to stamp duty, which again is a form of transaction tax. So from my perspective, charging people on the disposal of an asset is charging them tax on the transaction with respect to that asset. And therefore, I do not consider it a meaningful wealth tax. Now, the other area which I believe is being considered, and it's something that seems to be favored by Andy Burnham from what I'm hearing, is that he would like to introduce a land tax. And this is something I believe, many tax experts who, are considering something like a wealth tax, but not a wealth tax, are in favor of, essentially. And essentially what this would mean is that there would be a levy on tax on land holdings, essentially. And this would actually be a genuine wealth tax, albeit it's a very specific type of tax, which is focused on a very specific asset. And in some ways it makes sense because one would consider land sovereign. And therefore, if you are holding sovereign land that belongs to the state, one would suggest that, okay, much like council tax, for example, we should be considering a tax on that land holding. And this may affect developers as well, who hold land for the purposes of building on that land and then selling it on. And it may encourage them to basically develop that land. And that has always historically been the idea of a land tax. The idea being is that in order to pay the land tax, it incentivizes development on top of that land so that you generate meaningful assets in this regard, which then allow you then to pay this land tax, i.e. building homes, for example. So this may, on the face of it, be a very good idea. Again, it's very targeted, it's very specific. But again, that would be my one criticism of this type of tax. Although it could be very beneficial, it is very, very specific, and it doesn't actually target wealth in a meaningful way. And what I mean by that is that anybody who is holding any kind of assets for the purposes of building their wealth, they can simply divest, right? So if they have any land holdings, they can sell that land. And if there is a capital gains tax involved, obviously they'll be subject to that tax, but then acquire something else which is not subject to this land tax, essentially. So again, I think for me, that will be the one critique I would have of the idea of a land tax. Now, finally, the other area I wanted to discuss as well is that I've been hearing that he may look at inheritance tax and potentially overhaul this system. So at the moment, there are a number of things you can do in order to reduce or even eliminate your inheritance tax liability. And that's basically anything that's over and above the 1 million allowance that potentially would be available to you, which is shared between two parents, essentially, that may be leaving an estate to their children. And what I've been hearing, again through the grapevine, is that he may abolish this approach and just introduce a levy whereby no matter what it is that you pass on to your beneficiaries or your legacies, you will be subject to a tax. So in a sense, it's kind of like, in very simple terms, a wealth tax, albeit it only crystallizes as and when there is a death, and it would only be on what is actually passed on, right? So again, it is a wealth tax in a sense, but again, my own concern around this is that essentially, if all the remaining avoidance schemes are in place, such as, for example, transferring your estate into a trust, then what actually happens? What additional tax will actually be paid by the very, very wealthy? And I think for me, that would be my concern around this particular proposal, actually. So I hope you're enjoying the video, and please feel free to leave a comment, because it's always good to hear different perspectives on the topics we talk about here, and it's the way we learn. Otherwise, if you are new to the channel, please feel free to like and subscribe. In the meantime, if you are worried about your personal finances, the amount of tax you or your business is paying, or you're in a quandary around how you can scale your business by leveraging financing and accounting automation, please feel free to reach out to myself for a no obligation consultation. Otherwise, let's get back to the video. So I've discussed 3 ideas here, and this was an alignment of the CGT rate. So this is a capital gains tax rate with income tax, an introduction of a levy on land holdings, and a complete reformation of inheritance tax, so that no matter the amount that is inherited, the beneficiaries would have to pay a levy of sorts. And for me, these are all things that will essentially raise tax. However, my critique of all of these ideas, and why I think they don't go far enough, is that all of the relevant avoidance schemes are still in place, right? So if you think about CGT, for example, you can still offset any gains with actual losses, right? So if you have a capital gains loss, so if you sell an asset at a loss, unless they change that rule, you can still offset that loss against any potential gains. You can still transfer assets between married partners, and therefore you can avoid the tax that way. Secondly, the very wealthy are not incentivized actually to sell assets. They're incentivized to hoard assets, because what it does is it generates passive income, right? So if there's actually no difference between selling an asset or earning passive income, then there's even less of an incentive in my mind to sell the asset, right? So for me, that is the issue here, actually. This type of change will not impact the very, very wealthiest, because again, they don't actually need to sell the assets. And if anything, if there are more assets being sold by those that are less wealthy, it just means the very, very wealthy can buy up those assets. And for me, that is why I think there's a problem with that particular approach. And again, it would be the same philosophy I have actually, and the same issue I have across all the other different proposals. So again, if we come back to the land tax, what you can quite easily do, as I mentioned previously, is you can divest, right? So you can just say, you know what, I don't want to hold any land. I'll put my money in something else, right? And again, depending on what the rules are, if the same loss relief applies, i.e. you can sell land at a loss and use that loss to offset a future gain, then again, it mitigates any potential tax receipts that may arrive. So from my perspective, again, it has the same issue. It has the same flaw. Firstly, the reliefs and the avoidance schemes are still available. But more specifically, anybody that has a lot of wealth can simply choose not to hold or put their money into land, right? And maybe that's the idea of this particular incentive, right? To free up land, which can then be used and acquired by others, maybe. But in terms of purely increasing tax receipts and purely targeting wealth, I don't think it fully achieves those things. And then with respect to inheritance tax, again, as I've mentioned, if you can still put your money in trusts, if you can still do potentially exempt transfers, for example, if you can still gift regularly whilst you're alive, and completely reduce the estate of what's going to be handed over in the end upon your, unfortunate demise into the sunken place, then ultimately all the same tax planning arrangements for the very, very wealthy will be just as effective, right? So the only analogy I can use around all of this, in terms of what is being considered, it's like playing a game of football, considering it's the World Cup right now at the time of recording. And instead of a goal, equaling 1 point, let's say, it now equals 2, right? If the actual mechanisms and the rules are unchanged, the only thing that is changed is the rate, is the value of the goal, in terms of it's not 1 point now, it's 3 points now, then all the rules that allow you to avoid taxes are still just as effective. And it's basically those that can't benefit from taking advantage of those rules that will just end up paying more and more taxes. And I think for me, this is something that will squeeze the upper middle class and the middle, again, the most. And ultimately, this is why I still think these are not viable alternatives if the intention is to tax the very wealthiest in society. So in conclusion, my own feeling is there is still a need for a meaningful wealth tax. So despite Andy Burnham's position on this, allegedly, if what I'm hearing is correct, I don't think these things go far enough if the intention is to tax wealth. If the intention is simply to raise more tax receipts, then potentially they could work, because in my view, it's going to end up squeezing the middle and the upper middle class, who tend to sell assets, right? Who tend not to be able to constantly buy assets and live off dividend income, for example. But if the intention is to tax the top 0.001%, the billionaires and the trillionaires, I don't think these things will do anything. And I think for me, the criticism of wealth tax is where, again, what has been talked about is this administrative burden of valuing people's personal wealth, of capital flight, of basically disincentivizing foreign investment. These are all things that obviously do need to be considered, and we obviously do need to think about them. And there are genuine risks around all of these things. But I think my own view around all of this is that the risk reward to me, aligns more with the reward, right? I think what we're observing already is already doing a lot of damage. It's already doing a lot of harm to many working people. It seems as though the only meaningful way of increasing taxes is by continually looking at the upper class and upper middle class, I would say. And that is evidence, I would argue, in terms of the things that Andy Burnham is currently considering. And my own fundamental question around all of this is this sustainable in the long term, right? We can't keep, in my view, looking at the middle and upper middle class and ask them to pay more income tax, ask them to pay more CGT, ask them to give up more of their estate to the government, for example, and or be subject to any tax on any land that their houses are built on. So I think for me, this is why I think in the long term it doesn't really address these issues. But it will be interesting to see what happens when Andy Burnham comes in and what impact it has on the economy. My own feeling is, as I say, if he doesn't introduce a meaningful wealth tax, we're going to just see more of the same economic and societal issues we've been observing under Keir Starmer. As Gary Stevenson has predicted, and I'm inclined to agree with him, Andy Burnham will become more and more unpopular. And it will only sort of feed in to either the position of the right, i.e. Reform and the Conservatives, but more specifically the Reform, or the position of the left, ultimately, right? It's going to go one of those two ways, in my view, where people are going to feel more desperate for a meaning alternative to the mainstream parties. Because I think, unfortunately, for the Conservatives, and even potentially the Liberal Democrats, actually, they've been lumped into the same sort of political demographic as Labour, and they're perceived and viewed in the same way. And I think from my perspective, I think people have lost patience now with centralist, sensible politics. But let me know what your thoughts are and your feelings around Andy Burnham becoming Prime Minister and what your hopes and expectations are. But until next time, take care. Peace.